Welcome to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where history is learned through pop culture. I'm your host, Eric Paul. Photographer Rowland Scherman may not have as recognizable a name as some of his subjects, but you have seen his work. His photographs of the Beatles, Janis Joplin, Arthur Ashe, Bob Dylan, Woodstock, Lyndon B. Johnson, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and the 1963 March on Washington have graced galleries, textbooks, postcards, films, television, album covers, and other media since they were taken. Each one of his photographs are indelible documents of such a vibrant and visual time period. You know from listening to this show that when something is looked at as a primary source, it is important to ask who made it. Unfortunately, through a number of circumstances, and for a variety of reasons, Rowland Scherman's name has often been unattached to his work. Enter Michael E. Jones. Among his many distinguished accomplishments, Michael is a lawyer and professor of legal principles in the fields of the arts and entertainment. After befriending Rowland, Michael and his wife, Christine Jones, set to work putting the record straight on who took these famous pictures, without which our understanding of America in the 1960s would be that much less. The product of their efforts is the book Timeless, Photography of Rowland Scherman, a copy of which I picked up earlier this year and inspired the interview with Rowland and Michael you are about to hear. So the first idea that I want to bring in front of you is the relationship between law, government, and the role in the arts, particularly for photography. So Rowland, you were saying that you, depending on who is giving you the employment, to take photographs, that there is a bit of a trade-off that you had to do with your intellectual property that took place.
Yes, well, let's see. We're talking 61. JFK makes that speech about what you can do for your country. And I was charmed by him and by what the idea of the Peace Corps. And I immediately went to DC and invented the job of photographer for the Peace Corps, which I thought, this story, I've told this so many times, but it's one of those things that not only did I do something for my country, it made my career. I mean, I got a job that sent me around the world photographing the Peace Corps at work in dozens of countries, Hong Kong and Sumatra and Thailand, all over Africa, India, and so forth. And so at the age of 24 or something like that, without really knowing anything going in, I came out with like a terrific portfolio that it's hard to match. A kid like my age could hardly match a portfolio that's traveled so well and had so many tear sheets and so forth, because it really made my career. The flip side, when I went to get my negatives, no, the government owns those negatives. So it was the government work. It was one thing, and the fact that I made my career is something else. So right at the beginning. It's interesting
that, because I see a lot of parallels between the Peace Corps and, of course, later on AmeriCorps, but before that, the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s. And the federal government employed a lot of photographers throughout the 30s, didn't they, as a way to document New Deal programs.
That's an interesting point. They certainly did. And the guys that they hired became the iconic pillars of the pantheon of photography, Gordon Parks among them. And
I know there's Dorothea Lange. She always stands
Dorothea Lange is awfully, yeah.
Michael, I was wondering, because you mentioned in the book Timeless about the Supreme Court ruling in 1884, and then with the 1991 legislation, how do those two acts of government reflect how popularized photography was becoming in those times?
Well, what you have to look at, you have to start with the Constitution that gives Congress the power and the authority and the motivation to recognize the arts. And in a sense, it's a monopoly right when somebody creates a work of art. And then the question is, how do we define art? And there was a time, as Rowland knows, and Eric, you probably know too, that people thought the camera was the death of art because it could realistically portray images in a fashion better than any pencil drawing or any paintbrush. But we began to accept it as a different form, a different medium of art. So by legislation, by statute, the works of photographers like Rowland and Robert Frank and Arno Minkkinen were recognized as intellectual property, and they belonged to the person who created the art. In other words, the one who had the camera and pushed the little button, as the case may be. And that's still the case. Now, where it gets complicated is, you know, if you're an employee for somebody and they put you on an assignment, your employer owns that artwork. Rowland, I don't know, was ever really an employee. He, for the most part, was a freelance photographer, whether, especially for Life and Look and Saturday Evening Post and Paris March and all the other magazines he worked for. So the question that what the law basically now says, and at one point it didn't say, it was complicated, but even if you're a freelance photographer, you own the right to your work. So anyway, you know, for a lot of Rowland's work that somehow filtered into the public domain even though it's reproduced and you can find it, you know, in a Google search, all across the world, many of those images belong to Rowland. Even though people reproduce them, just because you reproduce them and copy them doesn't mean that you own the copyright to them. In some cases, Rowland still owns those copyrights. My role, which I presume, Eric, you're going to get to in terms of my wife and I, well, we all had a mutual friend who was a printmaker to lots of stars like Joel Meyerowitz and Annie Leibovitz and others. And his name was Bob Korn, and he still is a digital printmaker out of Eastham, Mass. And anyway, we were friends with Bob, and Rowland knew Bob too. And Bob said, "Can you help him, you know, with some of his copyright issues and just help him organize his affairs better?" And that's my area of expertise. So we put it together when we worked with Rowland and put together the compilation of images to basically tell the world, hey, listen, you know, here's Rowland. Some of the stuff is his intellectual property, and you need to be aware of it, because not only is there a copyright, but also there's a concept called moral rights. And moral rights exist that say artists like Rowland have the right to have their work attributed to them, whether they own the copyright or not. And that's what Rowland was referring to in terms of the government photograph. So the book, I think, has gone a long way, and Rowland can speak to this, but I think it's gone a long way to bring attention to Rowland's work, its historical significance, its cultural impact, resonates emotionally on so many different levels, and got the copyright to it. And listen, at the very least, you've got to give attribution. You've got to recognize Rowland as the genius behind these images.
You absolutely said it. It's iconic. It's definitive. It resonates culturally. Everybody emotionally can feel with it. Rowland, in the Eye in the 60s documentary that was made just over 10 years ago, you mentioned that you see light shining out of people. What was it about the era, the 60s in particular, that brought to you that such a profound thought?
It's a facile way of saying that I'm a pretty good portraitist, and it's what I do. But the feedback I'm getting from the people I photograph said, "You've really captured me. That's really the way I see myself too. How did you do that? You know?" So, and I came up with a phrase that some people have light shining out of them, and it's a gift. And I'm really, thank goodness for this gift that I get to see it a lot of times.
I think the other gift that Rowland sometimes undersells, he can be cantankerous and difficult to work with on occasion. However, he's charming in many ways. And I think he relates to people, and I think people trust Rowland. In the book, there's so many fabulous images, but I love the story, Rowland, about LBJ and why the picture you took of LBJ was the only one he ever liked.
Well, when Kennedy died and LBJ became the president, a lot of Peace Corps people were LBJ friends, and they moved over to the White House from right across the Lafayette Park. And one guy was Lloyd Wright, a nice Texan guy, and the president was Lyndon Johnson was angry that there weren't good enough pictures of him. He didn't like the way he looked in pictures, and it was Lloyd Wright's job to get him, get someone to make him look good. And they called me because he was a friend from the Peace Corps. And I came over to the White House, shoot, and I was doing the same stuff because LBJ is 6'5", and it looked. I suppose Lloyd Wright said he's getting what everybody else got. So Lloyd Wright stands up on the table and said, and puts his hand in the air and said, "Mr. President, will you look at my hand?" And for that 1 second, beep, the LBJ looks up and bang, that's the shot. And that picture turned out to be the official picture for the 64 campaign. It was blown up to an immense size, maybe the biggest photo ever made at the convention, like 50 feet by 60 feet, huge blow up. And the cover of his book. And strangely enough, I learned later that Norman Mailer reviewed the book and hated it, except for the cover. He said, if only LBJ was like the picture on the cover, it would have been a much better book. We hung out with Mailer for a while, and I only read that a few months ago, and I only wait a minute, we could have talked, we could have had a few laughs.
That's funny. Good stuff.
It's the 60s, I think, I don't know, they stand out that whole time period as being a new era, right? A very innovative time period, a lot of change. There's even change in technology that I think doesn't get as much scrutinized as it probably should. But in that time, were you discovering new techniques or even new kinds of cameras that were helping you do your job better throughout the 60s?
Yeah. But I wasn't I'm not a scientist. I love to work in a dark room, and I love the process of photography, but I really never got into some guys make their own film. I'm not in that realm. I realized early on that my first camera was a Nikon S2, which was like a Japanese copy of the wonderful Contax that the Germans made. It was so famous, but the Nikon made it a little better, and little bells and whistles on it made it much better. And so I sort of got into the Nikon realm early, but my heroes were using Leicas, so I switched to Leicas about halfway through.
I think with each of the different, I think of the movies, the television shows, the literature, the fashion, and of course music from the 60s, that there was a lot of people just like you who I suppose you could show the Beatles that their amplifiers and their guitars were getting more advanced, but they weren't really too concerned with that. They were more concerned what they could do with it. I'm in the audio world, and I talk to people all the time in the technical side of things. Well, it can get this many beats per minute. I don't even know what they're talking about. I'm like, I'm just using it more as an art form than it is an actual technical thing. But would you say that was the spirit of the 60s, was using this new technology to be creative, to really pour out creativity in whatever you were skilled in or interested in?
Yeah, an interesting question, but it's also a double-edged sword, because we were making better stuff, but we're also making better weapons, and we're using them on people. So that part of it was sort of scary. Someone who reviewed my most recent show, the one in P-Town, about the fact that I was shooting these pictures and making these images while the Vietnam War was going on, and Life asked me if I wanted to go to cover the war, and I had just gotten married a couple of months before, so no, I didn't want to go. But that probably was a mistake because you have to pay your dues. But I could have stepped on a mine and blown my ass off and never seen my wife again. And it's one of those things. The answer to the question is, which it's slipping away, but I know I was I know I had a valid. Oh yeah, the horrifying things were going on at the time, and I was shooting some of them. The marches and so forth. But all my pictures in the show, the portraits, were people looking happy and having fun. And all the musicians, it was everything was sort of upbeat in my show. It seems like when I say I photograph light shining out of people, I also show. It seems like my stuff is always good vibes.
Yeah,
A positive approach to the way things are and the way things look. And the more you show of that, good. And even though the picture of the little girl, naked girl, her clothes were blown off by napalm and screaming, the horrible pictures of that went on in the war, brilliant though they were, didn't stop the war.
right.
And Life magazine ran page after page after page, picture, dozens, hundreds of pictures of the guys that got killed in Vietnam that week, but it didn't really stop the war enough. What what did more to stop the war than anything? I thought was John Lennon making full page New York Times pages of the war is over if you want it.
Mm-hmm.
Now that kind of stuff, that guy really walked the walk as well as talk the talk. I mean, Frank Sinatra didn't take out full pages of the war is over if you want it in the New York Times.
Yeah.
A positive stretch and a negative stretch in that whole period, and it's hard to like.
But Roland, even the civil rights era, the March on Washington, in so many of the images are both inspirational and reflective. They show the march, whether it was John Lewis, who I got to deal with in terms of a quote for the back of the book.
And he was the last guy standing.
The last guy standing, yeah, for sure. But it talks, you demonstrate their struggles and their achievement, but throughout it all, there's a sense of hope that it can get better and it will get better.
Agreed. And that's the like the JFK legacy. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country to make it a better place and a better world.
Right. Hey, Eric, I don't know if in the cover, I know you got 10 questions, and you may only get 3 on the Edith Lee Payne, but there's a wonderful story because you're somebody who teaches history, interested in history and the educational value of history. Roland, why don't you share what we did at Denison? I think it was Black History Month, bringing Edith Lee Payne, this little girl, and how you reconnected with her, 50 years later, I think on the anniversary of the March on Washington or thereabouts.
A face in the crowd, absolutely beautiful face, which why I focus on her for a couple of shots, only a couple of shots. And then when we edited the book, what's going to be the cover? It turned out to be her, and I think it's that we made a pretty good choice. That picture, she has become the poster child for the march now.
It was, yeah.
When she's in DC, the park rangers want to get her to pose with them rather than the tourists want to get their pictures taken with park rangers. The park rangers want to get their picture taken with Edith Lee Payne. This picture's on buses, it's on flags, it's all over DC when that kind of stuff is going on, and we were very proud of it. Edith Lee Payne herself has remained committed to the words of Dr. King as well and as wisely as anybody there has ever done. And we all got to be pals because at the 50th anniversary of the march, the BBC found out who she was and found out who took the picture and got us together to be together at the march. And we've been pals ever since. Email, visited her in Detroit sometimes.
The name of my podcast says exactly my point of view on things. Everything is a primary source. Everything is a document. And so just in that story. We have several, right? Like you documenting on August 28th, 1963. And then Michael, when you're sorting out the book, saying we're going to have the beginning and the end, being bookended by the same story of two people meeting but not meeting in 1963 and then reuniting. And the setting itself, the National Mall in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln, and everything about the March on Washington was intentional and symbolic. And just I spend most of a class period with my students going through that. Where did they put the speaker stage? Where did the march actually go? Constitution Avenue, Independence Avenue. And where did it meet? Why not the Capitol steps? Why at Lincoln Memorial? What's the symbolism there? And even just the photograph itself, the pennant that she's holding indicates, I think, the same spirit of what you were doing there, in that it's a commemorative pennant. It says, I was there at the Lincoln Memorial for the March for Jobs and Freedom. And that's what you were doing there. That's why you were taking the pictures, because your audience wasn't necessarily the newspapers and the magazines in the 60s. It was meant for all time, correct? You're hoping that the future would look at this as well.
I don't know whether they knew it was going to ever be that big. They were, Kennedys, both Bobby and John, were sort of afraid that there might be a riot. And so they would sort of drag their feet about it, even having it. Finally, they got it okay. And in the movie, the Chris Rito movie called Eye in the 60s, well, one of the highlights of the film is that Dick Stolley, the editor of People magazine and Life magazine, my bureau chief at the time, made a comment about that. Oh my God, people are going to kill each other, but no, they're getting along, and that's why that was such an important time, an important vision.
So, Michael, you've touched on this a little bit already, but what motivated you to create the book itself? Was it the place of the same place as the Eye in the 60s documentary was made a few years earlier?
No, the movie had absolutely no influence. So I for the most part live a couple of different lives. An athletic life, I had some pretty serious athletic achievements over my life. But art, I live in the world of art. I study art. I've got more degrees than probably anybody you've ever met, and I know a lot about art and artists and intellectual property. So it's kind of been my life mission to help those artists that can't help themselves. And Rowland fell into that category. And I've worked with everybody from, the Cuban Artists' Rights Society and the Cuban government trying to get me to help them resurrect a copyright in probably the most reproduced image in the history of the world. And that's Che Guevara with the the beret, and trying to indicate to them that following the life of a guy named Alberto Corda, who was originally a fashion designer, photographer, and then came under the revolution, how that image got into the public domain, and the Cuban government just couldn't understand the public domain. Mm-hmm. But so, I mean, you name it. So from Cuba to, Arno Minkinen, who's Guggenheim fellow and all that good stuff. All these artists, whether visual artists, fine artists, have issues, contract issues, copyright issues, and things of that sort. And somehow they find me and I find them, and, for the most part, do it for gratis. What can I do to help you to protect whatever your property interests are or commercial interests? And so I met wonderful people literally throughout the world, including, Rowland, and we've become good friends over the years. And I'm happy again to have his work recognized in the small part that my wife Christine and I have paid in that route.
Can I ask, between the two of you, how did you settle on these 70 odd pictures? I mean, there's thousands. What was
We're going to have two different versions of this. Go ahead, Roland.
Well, no, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Okay.
There's
All
a
right.
lot of funny. There's a lot of funny
There's plenty of
side trips on this book, but
yeah. Well, Roland probably realizes that weren't for my wife, Christine, this book would have never happened, because we would have Roland over to our house with something to eat and drink and chat. And, you know, he would pick out, these are the particular images. This is the story we want to tell. This is the chronology or whatever it was. And then next week he would come and he would say, well, who picked out these 70 images? And I said, Roland, you did. Oh, I would never have picked these 70. And this back and forth all the time. And it was my wife, Christine, that says, no, 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 we're going to keep working this thing. I was ready to drop kick the whole project out. But that's just part of who Rowland is and how you have to learn to roll with him. It's also his strength, too, at the same time.
well,
Your
from
side.
my point of view, Christine and Michael were editing this book with scissors and tape, and the computer never got into it. There was no digital anything. All that stuff, all that stuff went out with horse buggy whips. I mean, this they were using it like let's make a book,
Yeah.
but they didn't know what they were doing. And I guess we had so it was a mutual collision of creative forces, and I was complaining about it a lot, but it's in its second printing now. So many people like it. I
Yeah.
stopped complaining about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
The way
Hey,
it turned out is
there were some delightful parts. I mean, working with Judy Collins to write the foreword was, hysterical.
all that
Yeah.
great stuff.
And the blurbs, I mean, John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, the late Congressman Lewis, I can't tell you how emotional he was, how thankful he was for Roland's work in capturing, that whole movement and the historical aspect and the classy way that he depicted, everything that took place.
Is that you that got John
Yeah,
Lewis to do the blurb on the back?
it was me. Yeah.
My compliments, because I got to meet him and we hit it off. He was a wonderful guy to hang around and
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
to me.
So, I mentioned before, I mentioned both of you that, my parents they're of that generation. They grew up in the 60s. They were teenagers in the 60s. When I shared this book with them recently, they loved it. They were just so happy to look at it, and it brought back so many memories and gave us each opportunities to talk about what do you remember of these things? And over the years they've shared, when things come up, where they were when different things happened and so forth. But was that I know that it was mostly to get Rowland the proper recognition for his work, but was there any part of this for memory, memorializing nostalgia for an era? Did that factor in at all to making the book, and maybe even preserving it for future generations in any way?
Every photographer I've ever known wants a book, and I mean, some guys do like 30 books, but all guys who make images, in fact, most artists would like to have their stuff blast and have a widest possible audience as can. And then book is a terrific way to do it. I made a couple of books of my own in the past, but this was like a retrospective of my work, and I'm really, really happy to have it.
Yeah, I think the book reflects the arc of living history, of Rowland's living history with the historical events and cultural events and social events that took place during that time. And Rowland, I mean, you got to talk about the Beatles. You talk about iconic cultural events, and and how
Well, yeah, the people keep saying I'm the Forrest Gump of photography. I always show up in the places where, all of a sudden something magic is happening, and I was just lucked out. Well, my sister was assisting the Beatles' personal photographer, a guy named Robert Freeman. And she called up and said, you might as well come down here. These guys are big. And I had heard their records because she had sent them to me. So I knew what was happening, but I didn't realize that I didn't have a ticket. I didn't have a press pass. It wasn't even 64. I think I'd finished my gig with the Peace Corps. I was freelancing. And so I just got in there and started shooting pictures, and nobody stopped me. So I got a little closer. Still nobody stopped me. By the time I was on my last roll of film, I guess I had 5 or 6 rolls, and I blew it all from so far away that you can't see anything. But the last roll of film, I had my elbows on the stage and like right next to it. It was just and my sister every time she sees one of the pictures, said, "You owe me a bottle of champagne because I got you into that." I got you into the got you into the Beatles. And it turns out, like it was their first gig in the States, the first live concert in the States. So historically that way as well.
Yeah.
Forrest,
That was
Forrest Gump indeed.
yeah. So Eric, that was right after the Ed Sullivan Show. So they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in New York, and then went to
Carnegie
DC.
Hall, right?
Yeah.
Sunday. We took a train down from New York to DC.
Yeah. But one of my favorite images in the book related to the Beatles is when Rowland was right next to the stage, filming the Beatles, and then he turns around and he gets these screaming girls, and one woman has a little button, I don't know if you can quite see it in the book, says, "I love the Beatles," but spells the word Beatles wrong.
They were so early in the game they couldn't.
Yeah. I mean, that whole that tour was so revolutionary, and you were mentioning how you were able to get so close to the stage. I mean, that wouldn't even happen a year later. They wouldn't, or maybe even later in the tour, it would have happened.
I got another little snippet about that for you, Eric.
Sure.
The Beatles are important because when they showed up in America, was it February in '64? Yeah,
Yep.
that's when that concert was. It was the one thing that knocked the gloomy JFK assassination headlines off the front page. All of a sudden, it wasn't, it was gloomy anymore. Music, fabulous film, fans going wild, fun, and so forth like that. It changed the whole sort of, it took away the gloomy perspective that Americans had about life. And then they started realizing that, sure enough, life goes on, and we should enjoy as much as we can, as best we can from now on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and this is, I think, an appropriate time to ask about the power of photography in all of this, because yes, the 60s had, by that point, nearly all the same kinds of media that we have now, minus computer stuff. But we still have so many photographs from that era, many of them yours, that are still so powerful. And you were just mentioning about the Kennedy assassination and the funeral, that famous photograph from Life magazine of John F. Kennedy Jr. saluting his father. That was just a few months before the Beatles showed up, like you say, and change everything. Why is it that, what is the power of the single static image that you can't take away from it? Motion pictures can't really even compete with it. What is the power of photography?
The fact that the image is not flickering and it's not changing. It was written by photo scholars that the camera sees better than the eye, because it freezes the image, and you can let your eye roam around it much better than you can even in real life.
Oh.
So that's one thing. And the USA, this is interesting. USA made a movie of the march, and it's not very good. But then there it is, moving pictures of stuff. I don't know what their story was, but they didn't. They weren't where I was. They just photographed snippets of speeches and snippets of images of people walking around, but it wasn't. And to look at it, even if it was excellently done, it never gets shown. The pictures I did are can go in magazines, can go in books, and it's part of an education. You can't do that with the movies so much as you can with a still image.
I think what the single shot image is able to do is it captures the humanity of the subject without the need for sound or words. It just speaks for itself. The good ones speak for itself. You don't need anything more than that. You don't need somebody to illustrate it, detail it, explain it. It's there. You capture that. When you see in the book some of the images of like Arthur Ashe and Rowland spent a week or so traveling with him, they just speak for themselves. His elegance, he's not even on the tennis court, and you can see his elegance. And yet he's engaging in the simple little non-pleasure that all of us have to do, and that is we've got to do our laundry.
Yeah, it's such a, and this particular photograph is just absolutely perfect for my next question. And is there a line between, as a photographer and just in photography, and I'd love to hear both of your input on this, being descriptive and prescriptive? In other words, when does a photographer go from being just documenting to then storytelling?
I don't philosophize it that way. To me, it was just doing a job. There's this black kid who's winning tennis matches. We want you to go photograph him and see what he's like. So I go and photograph him and see what he's like, and he's the real deal. It wasn't. I didn't add anything to this guy. I was just capturing some of the positive aura that he's putting out, the grace and the way he handled himself. A black guy that's beating everybody in tennis, and he's playing in Texas, and there's no black people in the audience anywhere, and they're not even allowed in the damn country club where he's playing, that kind of thing. He handled all that as well as Jackie Robinson handled his baseball career.
Yeah.
And that's why they built the tennis stadium. The best tennis stadium in the world is named after him, because he added to the living up to the humanity that we all should strive for, that kind of thing, or it was just doing the right thing, being the right person.
But I suppose, where I was going with it actually goes really well with the picture on the opposite page, because this one of him playing tennis could be just seen as documenting him as a tennis player. It's identifying him with what he does. But then the one with him doing his laundry, this one tells a story, and it's like that.
It's funny you should pick out that spread, because sport photography is damned hard. And I watch him play tennis for hours and hours. And that might be one of the 3 any good picture. Sport, it's a whole different realm. Fashion photography, and I guess my what's the word? Just is portraiture. I'm mostly a portrait making guy, and doing the job was making him look and the way he does, and show him the way I felt about him.
Hey, Eric, here's my analogy.
I'd like to hear that.
As Rowland knows, and a lot of people know, I have a pretty extensive sports background, been around a lot of great athletes, teammate of Spitz in '72 and all that good stuff. And the great ones, and I've known Michael Phelps since he was, a tot. The great ones make it look easy, even though we know there was a lot of work to get from point A to point B. Rowland's, the pictures look like this is easy, but the genius behind it, whether it's capturing shadows or backgrounds or just accidental, he makes look easy. And that distinguishes the great ones from the rest of us.
Yeah, because there's plenty of photographers that work for newspapers that just take a picture of a parade going by, and it looks like literally anyone could have taken that picture. It's
It
nothing
doesn't have any
special.
meaning. There's no
It's just-
concept. There's
Right, it's
nothing
just
to it.
documenting. But
Yeah.
then you have something like this one, which
You
you
got,
you
that's one of
lower
my
the-
favorite portraits.
I love it. And
That's an important picture.
you just lower the viewfinder a little bit.
One-
and
One snap,
totally different picture.
not click, 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 and get a thing. But just passing through, there he is. I knew he was the guy whose idea it was. You got to get a picture of him. You're covering it for USIA. There he is, all by himself in front of the Lincoln. How could you miss? But I was Forrest Gump. Lucky to be there.
I think finally, this is my last question. I actually have two last questions. We've already touched on one of them, which is of this collection, which one's your favorite? So we just did that. So, but we haven't heard from Michael yet. What's your? Mine is Arthur Ashe doing his laundry. Roland's is of A. Philip Randolph in front of Lincoln.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite, Michael, of this collection?
Yeah, I maybe two, and I'll tell you a little bit about Arthur Ashe. We got to meet Arthur's wife. Rowland knew her beforehand, but Christine and I did when we had an opening, actually associated with the book at the Leica Gallery in New York City. That may not be the right name, but I got to meet her and her kids. And in one of my teaching gigs, I think it was at Bentley University, I had one or two students, and Arthur was their not official grandparent, but Arthur helped raise them, the Ashe family. So, it's one of those full circle kinds of things that gives more meaning to it, and as an athlete can appreciate, what it takes to become great. But maybe the Edith Lee Payne, the cover one is just because there's so much history. Well, we started talking about historical events, and so after Edith and Rowland got together on the anniversary, which was the last image in the book, I think it was Black History Month at Denison University, Granville, Ohio, where I graduated, and lots of other family members. We had a sort of a civil rights showing, and Edith came and talked about her life and what all this meant to her, and Rowland did, and we had the Black Students Union and all kind of administrators and faculty and students. Fabulous event. Rowland spoke to classes. I think I spoke to one of the classes too. And that stuff resonates. It gives meaning to everything. So I would say this is it.
Yeah. I guess it was kind of a silly question on my part, because since you edited this and you selected that for the cover, that would be your favorite, if any of the other ones. My last question is, would our understanding as a society of the 1960s be complete without the photography of Rowland? Where do these photographs land among all the other documentation of that time period?
I wouldn't go far as to say that. I had more pictures in Life magazine in the last couple of years of the 60s, but a lot of them were like Senator Schmiercase shaking hands with 16 left-handed Boy Scouts from Des Moines or something like that. A lot of the stuff, it wasn't earth-shattering stuff. You're just doing a job. You're a freelance. You're as good as your last job, and they call up and Life magazine says go here and get that, and you do, and that's makes the job of it. But there are some really heavy hitters out there in the 60s besides me. I mean beyond me, and a couple of them got killed in Vietnam. These wonderful, brilliant journalists got blown away in Vietnam, and some guys are still around and were retired or died natural causes. But it's a whole different ball game. I mean, a whole different episode of your show to list them. And my advanced age and my memory is so shot that I can hardly remember names anymore. But Dennis Stock is one of them. Philip Holzman is another one. And of course, the great fashion photographers, Avedon and Penn and those guys. The whole pantheon of wonderful photographers that aren't with us anymore, I guess, make up the 60s. But now, in as much as everyone has one of these, and every day a billion photographs are made or more.
Yeah.
And people will say, well, none of them are any good. Well, let's say only 10% are good. That's still 100,000 or 100 million great photographs that are being taken every day. It's going on and on. It's just the 60s were great. It seemed like it would be a beginning of peace, but then again, the Vietnam War was going on too. So.
But yeah, I think you just, I don't think any of us can do justice to the question, but I think you just have to look at it in the context of the times. And so again, here's my athlete analogy. Spitz was the best ever in the late 60s and 70s, and Michael Phelps was the best ever in his era. But there are plenty of other great athletes that were just a millisecond behind both of them. Yeah. Some of it are just accidents of history, to be honest with you. I mean, Spitz fell on his face in 68, thought he'd never come back in 72, won his first race, got his confidence, and then won 6 more. Rowland's one of many, that have their place and to be recognized. And I don't even get a hold of Rowland every time we see his work someplace, but my wife and I, we travel a lot, get a lot of museums, and there are plenty of museums where when they have photography exhibits that we see Rowland's work on the wall, and that probably speaks for itself. And the fact that you and your students recognize and your parents recognize the value, that's what's important. It doesn't matter where he fits on the list. He's good, great for what he did and when he did it and how he did it.
I suppose that's just my awkward way of saying that to end as we started, he did do these things. These are his photographs. And if he hadn't taken them, we would be without that many, we'd have that fewer documents of an era that was so visual, that we need so many artifacts to piece together from. So
there were a lot of guys shooting besides me, but apparently what they all wanted was to get pictures of Martin Luther King. They didn't seem to think there was, the faces in the crowd or things. Some did, some didn't. I had a little badge said official photographer, March on Washington. I could go anywhere. I had this unbelievable access to anything. I went up to the top of the Lincoln Memorial and shot that snap. There were guys whose position was there, and that's the only place they were that whole day. And that was just, I had the entree of a lifetime. I could just hang out with the movie stars, shoot in their faces. I could go anywhere, do anything. It was a gift. I should have paid them to make me do it. But I was a hungry, young, ambitious photographer, and I worked my tail off that day. And I didn't know it was going to be that big, but once I saw that it was and that important, I worked extra hard. And I worked from like 8 in the morning to 8 at night and did the whole thing, never stopped. Didn't stop for lunch, nothing. Shoot, climb, walk, shoot, walk. Turned out the way it turned out. That was a gift.
Well, we appreciate the gift that you gave us. So,
well, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, no, it's been a wonderful time talking with you, and this is, I think, a wonderful way to end the season of my podcast, where we talk primary sources. That's what it's all about. So thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
What a way to cap off season 3 of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. It was an absolute honor and pleasure to speak with both Rowland and Michael, 2 makers and stewards of historical documents. Season 3 has been a great one for the EPS podcast. This show began as an extension of my classroom method, but has since transformed into an oral history recording platform and now an open source collaborative hub for students and teachers. Be sure to visit everything-history.com to learn how you can take part in learning and teaching history through pop culture. I post regularly on Instagram, even between seasons, so make sure you search Everything as a Primary Source and follow the program there. We'll be back with even more of your reactions to and relationships with artifacts of everyday life in a few months. But until then, this has been the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.